Hello, everyone. I'd like to continue my course on social crises in British history. Today, we'll be dealing with the 19th century, um, both before and after. First, let's look back at a review of what we've talked about so far. We talked about the Civil War of the 1640s and its aftermath, which included both Scotland and England. If you recall, they were not a united country at the time. And in fact, the Scots had kind of a love-hate relationship with the British monarch, sometimes opposing him, sometimes helping him, later on helping the Cromwell government after 1649 by going to Ireland. But anyway, the Civil War determined that Parliament had won. And even though the protectorate under Cromwell only lasted a dozen years or less, it set the pattern so that by 1688, Parliament was definitely in charge. In Scotland, there was continued demand for independence, which revealed itself in support for the Stuart kings and the famous or infamous Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was defeated. His forces were defeated at the Battle of Culloden in 1745, which is still remembered in Scotland. After which the Highland clans were really cut back in power. The chieftains were cut down in power, and you begin to get the Highland clearances. That is to say, the farmers are forced off their lands as the wealthier people take over. Sometimes those wealthier people are the old clan leaders. But here's a little map just to remind you of where all those clans are. They're all over the place in the Highlands. The orange is the Highlands. And as I said, the Battle of Culloden is not forgotten. There's a memorial marker. The Battle of Culloden was fought on this moor, 16th of April, 1746. The graves of the gallant Highlanders who fought for Scotland and Prince Charlie are marked by the names of their clans. At the same time, you have what is called the Ulster Plantation, where many people, many Scots, are given lands in Ireland, and they're dispossessing the Irish landowners. Here's a map that suggests the where how Ireland is divided up, and this is Ulster, and these are the counties. So you see them in kind of a whatever color that is, scarlet or whatever. The 6 Ulster counties that made up the plantation. I should note that these are not the same counties as today's current Northern Ireland. Today's Northern Ireland are Derry, Antrim, Down, Armagh, Tyrone, and Monaghan. We also talked about enclosures in both England and Scotland, where small farmers are forced off their land and big landowners take over. And here is a map that we looked at on the left side. You see all this shaded area. Those are the commons land where people could graze their animals. They could glean stuff that was left over. And that's 1700. By 1800, you see the whole place is different. It's all fenced off. We also talked about the rage for coffee houses in Britain in the 18th century, which ironically led to a demand for sugar, which in turn was fed the slave trade. If you remember, it started, we think, it started in Brazil, but for the British, it was in Barbados, the one of the sugar islands. And as someone pointed out to me last week, Cuba itself had a very large slave population. So all those islands had slavery. And we had the factory system, which, as I mentioned, has to do with I think, with discipline. That's the core of the factory system. But let's look at England in the 18th century, 19th century, and we have the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria. I'm trying to go back one screen, not having success. There we are. Victoria gets a lot of publicity in literature, in the movies and TV, but we're not going to talk about her at all, other than the fact that she reigned for such a long time that it gave her name to the period Victorian England, 1837 to 1901. But let's look at England before that. Social unrest. Connected with the factory system were factories and groups of people called Luddites. Luddites are hand workers who were very upset about the machinery that was taking over their lives, their economic lives, and they go around bashing machinery. This is a sort of a drawing of what may have happened. We also have, talking about some of these trends that we'll talk about more in this class, Methodism, which has a lot to do with social action, and we'll see. Here is what's going on with Methodism, which is based on outdoor meetings, not the old parish churches. And finally, in this regard, we'll talk about what's called Chartism, which is one of the first modern mass movements. And here is a Chartist demonstration, and I'll show this same slide again in a few minutes, and we'll look at what it says. The Luddites were textile workers, opposed to machines that were replacing skilled labor. And we're talking about workers' rights and the fear of job losses. And these demonstrations started in Nottingham in 1811, what some people have called collective bargaining by riot. Here's another picture of these guys using their hand tools to smash these early machines. The Luddites would meet at night near different industrial towns, and they would attack different machines in different areas. And here's a picture of the so-called Ned Ludd. That was the image of Ned Ludd. I mean, he's made up, but the leader of the Luddites. The government was very upset. Remember, we've talked about in this course who controls violence, and the government is really opposed to this uncontrolled violence, and there are show trials and executions, penal transportation, and by transportation we mean sending people off. A lot of them went to Georgia. I'm not sure if they were going to Australia in the 18th century, but certainly in the 19th century they were. Now, who were the Luddites? I'd like to show a short internet video here.
Living with opioid addiction can be a struggle, trapped in a cycle of opioid use, withdrawal, and cravings.
Between 1811 and 1817, Lancashire cotton weavers, Yorkshire framework knitters, and Midlands croppers began attacking mills and smashing the labour-saving machinery they blamed for their hardships. They were called Luddites, after a fictional youth named Ned Ludd, who had reputedly been the first to smash the new machinery in a fit of rage. In 1811 alone, some 1,000 frames valued at over £6,000 were destroyed, leading the government to make machine smashing an offence punishable by death. The riots soon spread across Yorkshire and Lancashire, and here at the National Archives we can read the account of the attack on Rawford's Mill, owned by William Cartwright. Cartwright describes how he had put his mill under military guard because civic power was no longer found to afford protection to individuals and their property. He went on to say how he had secured the windows and doors, and that 5 soldiers and several of his workmen had been sleeping at the property on beds provided by him, for approximately 6 weeks already in anticipation of an attack on the mill. A detachment of cavalry was also positioned in the neighbourhood, and a bell placed on top of the mill so that the alarm could be raised if needed. And Mr. Hale then describes what happened when the Luddites approached the mill. A great deal of firing and ransacking took place, and it continued for about 20 minutes from both sides. A great many of the windows were broke by firing into the mill, and with sticks the door was knocked down, but no entrance could be obtained. When several of the aforesaid were wounded, they were obliged to run away, and they scampered in all directions. From the testimonies of those involved in the attack, and later arrested and questioned, it is clear the Luddites were armed and well organised. William Hill, for example, describes how George Mellor commanded the group and was armed with a bayonet and bludgeon. William Thorpe commanded the pistols. Jonathan Dean was armed with a hatchet, and John Agden was armed with a sword. Despite these arms and preparations, the Luddites were seen off by the soldiers, and 2 of them killed. The Battle of Rawford's Mill was not the only time soldiers were used against the Luddites, as the government took a firm line, culminating in the hanging of 17 Luddites at York in 1813. While the peak of the Luddite riots was relatively short-lived, taking place between 1811 and 1813, their name has lived on to describe those opposed to industrialisation, and particularly automation. For some historians, though, Luddism was more than just an economic protest. It was an early expression of working-class political consciousness, as some demanded not just the removal of the machines, but the reform of Parliament as well.
Well, we're back to the Luddites again, who, as you see, have not just economic but also political demands. And it's back to this theme that I've spoken of before. Who controls violence in society? It's a major item. Here you have a mill owner, £1,000 reward, whereas on the night of Sunday the 19th, the mill belonging to, and then we get the names of these mill owners, Oateswood and Smithson, Thompson and Brothers, Dickinson Carr and Company, and cloth was destroyed. And they're offering £1,000. £1,000 is a very large amount of money, hereby offered to any person or persons who will give such information as shall lead to the conviction of any of the offenders on application at the town clerk's office or to any of the above named sufferers. 1812. All right, we're trying to move forward. There are other demonstrations, not just Luddites, but people, for example, we know in 1819, there's this cavalry charging a crowd of 60,000 people demanding parliamentary reform. It's this infamous Peterloo massacre, 1819, where 15 died and 400 to 700 were injured. And the initial response of the government was not to worry about those injured or dead, but to outlaw any meeting for radical parliamentary reform. But public opinion shifted, and by 1832, you have the first Reform Act of Parliament. We're not talking about universal suffrage, but they did do away with a lot of the inequities of voting. There's the story of one electoral district that has 7 people who they vote. And here is an image of what people considered happened at Peterloo, not Waterloo, Peterloo. And then you see here the cavalry officers charging and beating down the people with their sabers. It's a very ugly scene. And it's not forgotten. St. Peter's Field, the Peterloo Massacre on 16th August, 1819. A peaceful rally of 60,000 pro-democracy reformers, men, women, and children, was attacked by armed cavalry, resulting in 15 deaths and over 600 injuries. And I just want to note that the labor movement today has not forgotten Peterloo. Let me just get this out of the way. There we go. Here it is. Today, this wall on Bootle Street marks the northern boundary of St. Peter's Field in 1819. That's still there. I mean, it hasn't been forgotten. I'm going to move on from other kinds of what are considered protest movements, and we're going to look at Methodism first of all. Who was John Wesley? I assume you've all heard of him, but not quite sure what he was. 1703 to 1791. He started to preach outdoors, and he formed small Christian groups. He also appointed itinerant evangelists. His social message included the abolition of slavery and support for women preachers. But he's never left the church. He's continued to stay with them. Here we have Wesley preaching outside a church. The early Methodists were forbidden to preach in the parish churches. And here's a quotation. Wesley rode 250,000 miles, gave away 30,000 pounds, and preached more than 40,000 sermons. So we're not sure about those numbers, but they're big numbers. You could divide them by a large number and still have a big number. We also have the movement of Methodism, which reaches over to America. George Whitefield, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, 1740 to 1770. And they say he had strabismus, that is cross-eyed. And when people were close enough, they thought he was looking directly at them because of the way his eyes looked. And he had a great effect on crowds. It's a very strange situation. First started in the fields, at first reluctantly, but they think he preached at least 18,000 times to perhaps 10 million listeners. Obviously, a lot of repeat listeners. Come, poor, lost, undone sinner. Come just as you are to Christ. Now, there's no political message in there. It's just personal salvation is desired through enthusiasm and worship. And this is a period of what's called the First Great Awakening. The dominant figure in the 19th century is a man named Jabez Bunting. At the time, this is 1820s and 30s, and here you see this plaque here, Historic House for Dr. Jabez Bunting, leading Wesleyan Methodists in the London borough of Islington. And there on the bottom right, you see an outdoor meeting. And notice this musical instrument, people standing around ready to pray outside. Bunting was anxious to avoid what they called the Jacobins. And remember, this is at the time of the French Revolution. So anytime someone wants a political change, he's called a Jacobin. And Bunting, after 1812, disowns Methodist Luddites. He says the two are not compatible. After Peterloo, he also disapproved this approbation of certain tumultuous assemblies. He had reduced concern for women and children, but there's still these big outdoor meetings, such as this one. It's also said that Methodism was important for work discipline in the Industrial Revolution. And we're pretty sure that from 1780 to 1830, the, quote, average English working man became more disciplined, more reserved and methodical, less violent, less spontaneous. That is to say, the Luddites have been overcome and people are more ready to go to work in probably a factory situation. And here are some of what are called the satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. Child labor, as you see here, the children were small, could get behind these machines to fix broken threads. Women working here, another factory. Remember, I still think that the main thing is the ability to impose discipline. If you think about what's happening today, with employers and the government demanding that people come back to the office, that's because they want to supervise them, see what they're doing. They don't trust them. They want to exert discipline on them. The Methodists have pressures toward discipline and order in the factory, in the Sunday school, and personal relationships, orderly moral conduct. And Methodism is sometimes seen as neo-Puritanism. That is, the laborer is turned into his own slave driver. Although there are other people who sometimes claim that Methodism meant radical social unrest. So there is this trend of Methodists being upset with what's going on, but in the main, they are quietist. And I give you this book. It's one of the more famous history books, The Making of the English Working Class. And E.P. Thompson talks a great deal about Methodism in here and what it did to the early working class. Well, in addition to the Methodists, in addition to the social unrest that's involved with Luddites and the Methodists, you have something else going on, corn laws. Now, corn laws, which came in 1815, are a protective tariff against foreign wheat. And what happens when you have a tariff? Your internal prices go up. So who profits? It's the people who own these large farms. There's an anti-corn law league, inspired by a man named Richard Cobden, whose name is well known, until finally they repealed the corn laws. But in between, while they're in effect, you have the radicals who oppose the corn laws because they want cheaper food. And you have the liberals because if the food's cheaper, they can pay their workers less. And this has an effect on the Irish potato famine, where for a long time they kept exporting grain to other countries rather than put them into Ireland, where people are starving to death. And we'll see more about Ireland in next week's talk. Well, the movement for political reform starts about who can vote. And in 1832, we have the Great Reform Act, where they reapportioned voting areas. And if you notice this cartoon, the reformers attack on the old rotten tree, or the foul nests of the cormorants in danger. The cormorants are these landowners. And this is what's called the rotten borough system. What that Reform Act expand the franchise. It standardized the property qualifications to vote, but it's still important. You have these property qualifications. It's not universal suffrage by any means. It gave the vote to middle-class men, not women. Remember, women don't get the full right to vote in Great Britain until 1928. In order to get the House of Lords even to pass this bill, the king threatened to make enough new peers to make it pass. And this is something that you will see has occurred several times in the 19th century, this threat to the Lords, until they finally become what's emasculating the House of Lords. We'll come to that. But the House of Lords is still important. At this time, you have a movement of Chartism that continues after the 1832 reform. There's this petition to Commons with 1.3 million signatures. And the Chartists say they want universal male suffrage, equal size electoral districts, voting by secret ballot, no property qualification for members of parliament. So it doesn't say you don't have to have property to get in there. And they want pay for members of the parliament so that moderate income people would be able to serve in parliament. They also want annual elections of parliament. Now, they don't get all these things, and Commons doesn't accept this petition, but it is a very big deal. Here's again a drawing of what it looked like, and what's important is the 1840s, where you have these revolutions of 1848 all across the continent, whereas England has a demonstration, not a revolution, despite the fact that the property classes are afraid of the Chartists, which is called the first mass working class movement in the world. And here is that chart that I showed you earlier. Chartist demonstration, peace and order is our motto. To the working men of London, fellow men, the press having misrepresented and vilified us and our intentions, the demonstration committee therefore consider it to be their duty to state that the grievances of us, the working classes, are deep and our demands just. We and our families are pining in misery, want, and starvation. We demand a fair day's wages for a fair day's work. We're the slaves of capital. We demand protection to our labor. We are political serfs. We demand to be free. We therefore invite all well-disposed to join in our peaceful procession on Monday next. And it is for the good of all that we seek to remove the evils under which we groan. Now, this idea of a mass petition is a big deal in English history. If you recall, the Covenanters in Scotland in the late 1630s signed this covenant that they are determined to protect their religious freedoms and other freedoms. And we'll see the same thing happens when we talk about the Irish later on. So mass petitions are a big deal. If we look further at electoral reform, they finally went to 1867, which is the first enfranchisement of the urban male working class. And it says all male heads of households could vote. And here you have this balance of power between lords and commons and political parties. And the devil of reform is threatening these guys. Just to bring you up to date, in 1911, under the Parliament Act, the House of Lords lost its right to veto money bills. This is after a few years after the king had threatened to appoint a number of new lords to get the budget through. And by 1949, the House of Lords had lost most of its veto power. As far as women go, in 1918, women were allowed to be elected to Parliament, and in 1928, women could vote on equal terms with men, that is, be over age 21 with no property requirements. Here you have an attack on Prime Minister Asquith before the First World War. Your representatives in the House of Commons by a majority of 110 voted for our bill, but Mr. Asquith put his veto on it. Therefore, we call on you to censure Mr. Asquith by voting against the Liberal candidate, the Liberal Party. And it's signed by two women we'll mention in a few minutes, Emmeline Pankhurst, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence of the Women's Social and Political Union. This is the second of famous history books I want to mention here. George Dangerfield, The Strange Death of Liberal England. A phenomenally successful history book written in 1935 and still in print and still exerting an influence on the way people write history. In fact, when we talk about the 20th century, I will show you a book of about 800 pages where the guy is trying to oppose Dangerfield. Still feels it necessary to talk about that. So what Dangerfield says, The Strange Death of Liberal England, liberal meaning the Liberal Party. And he talks about three major elements of political turbulence. First is Home Rule for Ireland. We'll talk about that next week. Second is the campaign for women's suffrage. And the third is a wave of strikes. Now, first of all, we have this reduction of the power of lords. So, who are the lords? What power did they have? And this has to do with Dangerfield's talk about empowering commons. And it's the budget. As they say, pity the poor but honest dukes against the people's budget. Which is your side in the great fight, peers or people? And it's very significant that the House of Lords, as you see in this big picture here, is losing more and more power. It's, essentially England today has essentially a one-house legislature. In 1999, most hereditary peers were removed from the House of Lords. 92 remained. And as of 2023, there are 784 members of the House of Lords. These are people who have gotten their appointment by the king. The average age is about 71. They're aging. Just to note, what does the House of Lords do now? It considers and reviews draft government bills before they become law. It investigates public policy through its select committees. It holds the government to account by asking questions to ministers during debates and question time in the chamber. And you should know that British Parliament is very raucous with these question periods. It doesn't have the elegance and politeness that sometimes one thinks you should associate with the government. Unlike the House of Commons, it cannot remove the government from office and can only delay most bills. Now, for a while, the representatives of the House of Lords acted as a kind of British Supreme Court, but in 2009, they even set up the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. So, what does this have to do with these strikes and labor unrest? Well, unions are first legalized in 1824. There are some predecessors, the 1820 general strike in Scotland, with things like child labor. I mean, in the mines, this is notorious. Loveism is, we just saw in 1811, 12, 13, 14. But then once these unions are around, you have, in 1831 in Wales, the coal and steel workers in Merthyr Tydfil protested against lowering their wages. We're used to strikes being about raising wages, but you don't hear too much about the attempt to lower wages. And this Merthyr Tydfil protest spread to the whole area, and it's the first use of the red flag of revolution. Well, by the end of the 19th century, the unions are going up and down. I don't want to go into any detail right now about what happened during the 19th century, but at the end of the 19th century, the Taff Vale Railway Company in South Wales sues the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants for losses during a strike. So something happened. There was a strike and there was some damage to the Taff Vale Railway. And the House of Lords, they're going back to work here, grim return. But in addition, the House of Lords, which still has this decision, decides that the unions are corporately liable for any damage or injury caused by any person deemed to be acting as its agent, which means that if someone's on strike and he throws rocks through the windows of a factory, the union is responsible. And it exposed trade unions to being sued every time there was an industrial dispute. In this particular case, they had to pay what was then an enormous fine, £23,000, which threatened to bankrupt any union involved in a strike, because they could just point to any kind of damage done by anybody and say it's the union has to pay. There was a strong reaction to Taff Vale. It gave a boost to the rudimentary Labour Party, and by 1906, there are 29 Labour Party members of Parliament, and in 1906, the Trade Disputes Act removed union liability for damage by strike action. But Taff Vale is not forgotten. Here we are. Even today, South Wales and West of England Regional Council, we honor the Taff Vale Railway strikers of 1900. So, Taff, people remember. The Lords, often with liberal support, the Liberal Party continued to legislate unions. When they would say people insist on a living wage, well, you're impairing the freedom of the employers to enter into some kind of agreement with the employees. At the same time, Labor raised enough money to begin to pay a salary to its members in Parliament, which allows working men to serve in Parliament for the first time. Because before that, you had to be independently wealthy. In the House of Commons, Keir Hardie, the Labour Party leader, proposed what he called socialism in 1901. He says that land and the instruments of production should be in the hands of the state and that socialism will democratize the country. Now, it's not socialism in a revolutionary form. If we look at what he asks for, home rule, democratic government, justice to labor, no monopoly, no landlordism, temperance reform, healthy homes, fair rents, 8-hour day, work for the unemployed. These are a lot of things that have become institutionalized in governments. But this was not a revolution, but revolutionary to call for these things. Hardie himself had a kind of ethical socialism, and there was moving toward a coalition of religious dissenters and the Labour Party. And if you look at this, it just strikes me there's a religious notion of this kind of poster. Merthyr Burrows, vote for Keir Hardie. My Welsh isn't good enough to read that. On the eve of World War I, there's something that was set up called the Triple Alliance of the National Union of Railwaymen, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, and the National Transport Workers Federation. It's ironic that if you're a history buff in the First World War, Triple Alliance meant something else. That's what they called Britain, France, and Russia in their alliance against Germany and Austria-Hungary. But this is the Triple Alliance of workers organizations. And they talked about a general strike for a living wage. It never came to a general strike meaning shutting everything down. But lots of these notions are halted by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. But we will see next week that there was a general strike in the 1920s. Things were not great in Britain. The final item that I want to deal with today, and it's the second item from Dangerfield's book, The Strange Death of Liberal England. We had trade unions. We have the women's rights, spearheaded by, in this case, the Pankhurst family, the mother Emmeline and the sisters Christabel and Sylvia. And what they come up with is the slogan, deeds, not words. The movement for women's suffrage starts in 1865. Initially, they talked to the Independent Labor Party, but they set up the 1903 Women's Social and Political Union, which invigorated their movement with women only, and they say, deeds, not words. Votes for women were very controversial. There was deliberate imprisonment for acts of militancy. Initially, spitting at a policeman. You got the attention of the press, and the press invents this word suffragette, which is initially a contemptuous term. This particular cartoon, they're using suffragists. He's only a mere man, jump on him. But that was their image. It happens that the Pankhursts, the mother Emmeline and the daughter Isabel, were kind of really dictatorial and were upper class. They weren't interested in necessarily in social reform. But they did lead a movement against police brutality outside of Parliament. And you get an escalation of militancy. They broke windows. There were show trials. What really upset some of the people in Lords was the fact that they disrupted their golf games. But these people go to jail. Hunger strikes, force feeding, and it's horrible if you look at this picture where they're sticking a tube down the nose because women would clench their teeth and they force the food down. A lot of injuries. And you should know that this same thing was happening in the United States at the same time. You know, the American suffragists, at least the radical ones, the one name that you may be familiar with is Alice Paul, also were arrested on ridiculous charges. And there was this force feeding, a terrible situation in the prisons. In 1908, demonstration in Hyde Park drew as many as 500,000 demonstrators in favor of women's suffrage. In 1913, there was this infamous case where this woman, Emily Davidson, jumps out of the crowd in front of the King's horse at the Derby, and she dies. You notice the headline, Suffragette Outrage at the Derby, not that a woman was killed, but that the horse was interfered with. The Women's Social and Political Union splits apart because Sylvia, one of the daughters, has social sympathies. She's expelled. She goes to France and tries to organize from there. Emmeline and Christabel are really upper class in their sympathies. Sylvia has ties with the Labour and Liberal parties. She actually worked with David Lloyd George, who becomes prime minister during World War I from the Liberal Liberal Party. Here you have the Women's Freedom League, women's suffrage. In 1918, finally, you get the vote granted to women over age 30 with a certain amount of property. And in 1919, as even though the Pankhursts are declining, with Sylvia sympathetic to the Bolshevik Revolution, the kinds of social changes she wanted, by 1928, equal suffrage in Great Britain. Well, I'm going to stop here and look ahead to Ireland for next week. Ireland is an issue for the British and for the Irish that has never been settled, and it's still not settled. But we have this is a map of the English plantation of Ireland in the 16th and 17th century, meaning English landowners are given land and they kicked Irish landowners off their land. Later on, they really dominate the poor Irish peasants. But this is as far as we're going to go today. I'm going to stop here. And I thank you for watching. And we'll continue with the Irish next week.